Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused TV channel. You can watch MNTV 24 hours on our website, muslimnetwork.tv, on Galaxy 19 satellite TV, which beams into 57 million homes, on Amazon Fire, Apple TV, Roku, and various other social media channels. Today, we'll be discussing African Americans and Islam, the past, present, and future. My esteemed guests today are Sister Islah Abd'al-Rahim and Sheikh Muhummad Jaaber. Welcome to both of you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Sister Islah. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So just a brief bio of our sister here. Sister Islah Abd'al-Rahim is a writer, an artist, and an educator who converted to Islam in 1976. Her work in Islamic and secular education is informed by her belief that it is her moral imperative to seek the truth persistently and act on it faithfully. Currently a PhD candidate in Islamic sciences, she has earned degrees in English, education, and administration from Coppin State University and Johns Hopkins University. She's also the author of 2 books, The Islamic Book of Lists and Random Lamentations, Protest Chants, and Affirmations. Thank you so much for being here, Sister Islah.
Alhamdulillah.
Our other esteemed guest is Sheikh Muhammad Jaaber. Muhammad ibn Hisham Jaaber is a forensic historian with a special interest in Islamic, African, and American history. He's also the son of the late Haji Hisham Jaaber, who performed the final funeral rites of Malcolm X. Sheikh Jaaber formerly served as the Imam for Muslim communities in New Jersey, South Carolina, and New York. Currently, Sheikh Jaaber is the executive director of BIMA, the Bureau of Indigenous Muslims Affairs, Incorporated. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for taking time off you, both of your busy schedules, for being with us here today.
Thank you for having us.
So my first question is directed to Sheikh Jaaber. Sheikh Jaaber, I wanted to talk a little bit about your father and sort of get this really amazing history that your family has sort of out of the way so we can dig deep into the rest of the conversation. But your father was of Sudanese origin, and he was the member, from what we read, of the Adeneo. Can you share more about this organization and his work and how he met Malcolm X and was his mentor?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yes, just briefly talk about my family. My great-grandfather came to the Americas as a slave. He was captured at the age of 9 from the city or country of Mali. And as a very young person, growing up in the slave culture, he lost a lot of the culture and memory, because remember, he was just a youth. But however, he would pass the cultural norms down to his children. He actually was freed at the age of 50 and married at 50. So he had started a family at a very, very late age. However, my father's father, my grandfather, did not follow an Islamic path. He actually was a Baptist minister. And he had hopes that my father would follow that path. However, my father, after attending Morehouse University, a theological seminary, to learn about the religion of Christianity, lost all hopes because of the echo of our past cultural heritage. And he joined the military and he traveled to 2 Muslim countries, Morocco and Algeria. And when he came back, he connected with the Adinullahi Universal Arabic Association, which was founded in 1936. That is the oldest chartered indigenous Sunni Islamic organization in America. And it was started by the late Muhammad Izzeddin, who actually got his education from Al-Azhar. And my father, during the time of the assassination of Hajj Malik Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, was the national imam of that organization. And of course, he was the one that was chosen to actually perform the janazah. Because Malcolm himself was in the early stages of Islam, and the two organizations that he had formulated, the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which was not an Islamic organization, and the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which was a Muslim organization. However, they had not been trained to facilitate the religious affairs of a Muslim. So that's how my father ended up doing the janazah. One question you asked me is the affiliation or the mentoring of my father to Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. One thing that many journalists don't know about Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, is that even before he defected from the Nation of Islam, he would secretly meet with the Sunni Muslims. Occasionally, he would go to 72nd Street and Riverside Drive in New York and sit with Imam Shawarabi, who was the imam or the director of that center. He would sit with the late Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal, who started the American Muslim Mission in New York, and also my father was a part of that transition team.
This is fascinating history, and a lot of times it gets glossed over. Sheikh Jaaber, let's talk about Black Muslim history beyond Malcolm X. What are some points about the past that you wished more people were educated about?
We just recently finished a second edition of the book that my father wrote, I Buried Malcolm. And we was actually trying to address or answer the cry of his wife, the late Betty, Hajar Betty Shabazz, who said the Black nationalists has claimed Malcolm, the liberals have claimed Malcolm, but when are the Muslims going to claim Malcolm? And we saw that as a cry, or an outcry for someone to really bring Malcolm back into the folds of Islam. Unfortunately, people look at the transition of Malcolm as being something that is stagnant. For example, in his early stages of Islamic development, he was a Pan-Africanist, he was a Black nationalist, he preached separatishness and things of that nature. And much of that part of his life is still echoing in the society. In fact, the Black Power movements did not evolve until after his assassination. However, much of Malcolm recanting regretful life prior to embracing Sunni Islam has not been captured. So we wanted to actually bring the Malcolm back into the folds of Islam, because if we do not do that, then people will continue to believe that Malcolm was a hate monger, he was a Black nationalist, he was a racist, and things of this nature. And truly, if we look at Malcolm's transition with the Shahada, Malcolm was only a Muslim, a Sunni Muslim, for 9 months before his assassination. He took Shahada April 8th, 1964. He made his pilgrimage, and then he was assassinated February 21st, 1965. And that is the Malcolm, that is the Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz that we try to rescue from the Black nationalist misinformation or misunderstanding about his life.
SubhanAllah. Sister Islah.
Yes.
I'll ask you the same question as well. What are some points about the past that you wish more people were educated about?
Alhamdulillah, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. In general, I think we need to revisit how history is written. We tend to still see history through a very Eurocentric, Judeo-Christian centric perspective. So at some point, we, the Muslims, would have to go back and look at history and make sure that we integrate, as our brother has said, the things that have been told in the narrative that aren't accurate. There's some things that are exaggerated. There's some things that come from a particular perspective. So in terms of what I would want or hope that we would start to look at is basically going back to the accuracy of things. It's not even feasible that we would continue repeating the narratives that have been taught to us when we were young and in our history books. We need to re-examine that. There are a lot of things that are being discovered now about our history, about the contributions that Muslims have played in the establishment of this country, African American and other nationalities and ethnicities, but they all have played a role in the establishment of this country. And that's sort of overlooked, glossed over, and we need to make sure that that is highlighted. So, you know, in terms of as an educator, one of the things that I wish we understood was that, because it's important to have representation in curricula, and when you don't see yourself, it's easy to not see the relevance. So one of my goals is to make sure that the ways we set up our curricula, our training programs for teachers, our educational programs are culturally responsive and do reflect the totality of our experience and do include the Muslim history in that. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. And currently you're conducting research. Can you share what you're working on?
Alhamdulillah. Well, I am currently pursuing a PhD in Islamic sciences. And the reason why I chose that area, alhamdulillah, is because I've been involved in teaching Islamic studies for a number of years, for decades. And I'm also an educator. And I wanted to look at how those two areas come together. So my dissertation is basically on the intersection between race, religion, and language in the Arabic acquisition processes of Black and Latino converts. So I'm looking at how language represents power and control, and in this case, the Arabic language, who has access to it, how it has been promoted to be learned among the converts, how we're being taught Arabic, who controls that teaching, and whether or not there are any cultural implications. So I've done a survey of close to 300 Muslim converts to determine their beliefs and feelings and dispositions about learning Arabic, their experiences, whether or not they've have had to deal with any prejudices or microaggressions in the learning process. How do they feel they learn best, and if that's being addressed? And I'm also doing in-depth interviews with probably about 15 people who have achieved some level of Arabic proficiency and who are Latino and Black Muslim converts in the West. And I'm trying to find out how their experiences relate to what the surveys are saying. So really, it's a new field. When I did my literature review, I found that there were no research studies on how we as Black people learn this language. And the Arabic is such a critical portion of our deen, understanding that Arabic, that, you know, I wanted to make sure that I went back and tried to capture this. So I'm hoping that this will be the start of other researchers coming behind me and improving on what I come up with, and also opening the doors for further research.
Powerful stuff. We're going to take a quick short break, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. So I wanted to ask Sheikh Jaaber about his experiences with what Sister Islah was talking about before the break, about Arabic and its the use, learning it in the African American community and amongst Black Muslims.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yes, when we talk about Arabic,
We can't hear you.
Are we on now?
Yes.
Yes. Again, I am a recipient of the oldest Islamic institution, Sunni Islamic institution in America. We refer to it then as Orthodox Islam. And our institution was established in 1938 by Professor Muhammad. When we talk about Islam, we have to set a standard of what we mean when we say Islam.
Sister Islam, while he, perhaps we can work on the next question while we get Sheikh Jaaber. Inshallah. So my question to you would be, what knowledge and aspects of Islamic heritage remained embedded in the culture of African Americans, despite the stripping of their Islamic identity as they were brought in as enslaved people?
You're right. There were things beyond the religion that were stripped from them. So I wanted to mention that first, address that, set that context, because for African people, and for Muslims especially, lineage is of utmost importance. Knowing who you are and where, from whom you descend is important. Knowing your history. So between the lineage that was lost and the history that was lost, that's a significant part of your identity. And then also certain values that may have been instilled culturally may have been compromised or lost. And I'll give the example of women, or not just women, people who were stripped and put in the holds of ships, who had a sense of modesty and decorum and were thrown into the hulls of ships like cargo. That over time, and the stripping of your identity and your humanity through enslavement also serves to undermine your sense of self. So those things had an effect. But there were things that we still retained, alhamdulillah. We still, even on these shores, were a law-conscious, God-conscious people. No matter what we called him, we were a people who were very much aware of the existence of a higher power. And that did not end. It's something that you cannot extinguish, because it is transferred and transmitted from generation to generation. We also retained some Arabic words and phrases. And I think a lot of people have done the research. This is not my original research, but names like Bilal being a derivative of Bailey. Bailey is, being a derivative of Bilal, and Suli, Suleiman, Solomon. There were words and phrases that were carried over. But I also noticed that within our religious rites, in the days of slavery, some of the slaves would participate in a form of worship that they called the ring shout, and they would circumambulate some structure, or rock, or tree, or they'd circumambulate while they were shuffling and saying a chant. And some historians and scholars have likened this to making tawaf. And what's interesting is that the ring shout was done in a counterclockwise motion, as is tawaf, as is the circulation of blood in the body and other things. So it was a connection there. That divine connection was not lost with that. Another thing that we retained was an eastward orientation, because if you look at some of the graves of slaves that were buried in the South, You see some that or see graveyards where the graves have a decidedly Eastern orientation, burying the dead facing east. So that's another one. And then we also have certain recipes and foods like okra and things that still come through our West African traditions. Don't have as much to do with the Islamic part, but shows you that there were things that we retained and that those enslaved people tried to hold on to. Alhamdulillah. Can't hear you. I can't hear the sound.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. MashaAllah.
Inshallah, could we bring Sheikh Jaaber in? Inshallah.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, Sheikh, I'd like to get your take on this as well. What knowledge do you believe that was retained throughout that time, despite the stripping of the Islamic identity?
Well, one thing is that we have to understand that all of the people that came by way of the African diaspora weren't Muslim. It was like maybe 1 out of every 3 or 4 persons that were in the slave culture was Muslim. And and that's a very interesting area of our experience. Why? Because if you look at the tribal conflicts that was occurring inside of the continent of Africa, you find the Muslims, in many cases, were at odds with other traditional philosophies or religions inside of Africa. However, when Islam reached the shores of America in its very early stages, they were enemy tribes, that were, on the plantation, meaning that if you were Fulani or you were a Hausa or a Mandinka or something of that nature, then you would have had a different relationship with someone that was Yoruba or Igbo or Wangara or things of that nature. So we have to make it clear that every person of the African diaspora was not a Muslim. And I think that a lot of times when we talk about Islam, we speak of it in the context that possibly 90% of the slaves that came into America were Muslim. And that's not true. Though the Muslim culture and the Islamic identity was preserved more so than the non-Muslims in the first, second, and third generation. However, after 4 generations of servitude, I think that the African-American experience, the slave culture erased all the cultural identity from the people, and they became monolithic. So when we talk about Islam in America from the position of people of African diaspora, it is a new introduction to the people, because nowhere in the history books did it mention Muslims in the, standard American history text. So it appears that Islam entered into America as a foreign ideology or foreign religion. But we have evidence, as early as the 20s, the brother Seti Majid, who came from Sudan, and right after World War I, he began to teach Islam. We had something called the Moorish Science Temple. He himself attacked all pseudo-Islamic groups and tried to make the correction. We have the Ahmadiyya movement by Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. He also tried to make the correction with that. What I'm saying this to say that Islam has been in our culture for 100 years, but yet we start with Islam in the 40s and 50s. Okay, when we have organizations that were established in the 30s that we have no narrative about it. For example, if I say the Dinullahi Universal Arabic Association, it's probably the first time that a contemporary Muslim have heard that name. If I say Sheikh Muhammad Izzuddin, it's probably the first time they ever heard that name. And I'm saying this to say that there have been a great suppression of the Islamic identity. My father did a janazah for El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. He appears in the current report for social disorders. He's also in the Black History Ebony magazine. He appears in many, many photos, but yet his name is not mentioned. They don't mention that Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, was buried by a Muslim, and who were these Muslims and what was the organization, and so forth. We'll have tons of information about the early presence in the culture. And what happens is that all of that has been circumvented, and they start with Malcolm's defect of the Nation of Islam And as though Malcolm obtained his true understanding of Islam when he made the pilgrimage to Mecca. You see, this is misinformation. When Malcolm himself, knew about Muslims in America, and there was a thriving Muslim community in America that needs to be inserted. People like myself have not been mentioned or even recognized in the historical fabric of the evolution of Islam. As I mentioned earlier, there was nothing missing in our education as a Muslim. There was never a conversion or a transformation that was needed because we started out on the Sunnah. Professor Muhammad himself came back from Egypt as a representative of Seti Majid to continue his mission. So I'm saying this to say that the contemporary information about the history of Islam in America has entered into what we call the literary world. We have 617 declassified FBI files on our organization of interrogation and all types of negatives to try to stop the growth of Islam. However, when we look at the life of Hajj Malik Shabazz, we take that as a standard as how Islam reinvented itself in America. And I think that this is poor research. I think that this says something against historians who actually trying to bring the truth about what was Islam, how it was in the early 20s and 30s. And as Muslims, I think we have to stop looking at Islam as an evolving identity or an evolving philosophy that reached this full development in the 1900s and so forth. We as Muslims understand that Islam was perfected during the time of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him. And there have been pioneers who have championed that and kept Islam unadulterated in its pristine, pure form, even in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And they are living recipients of that no one ever come to and talk about those actual highlights in Islamic history.
Well, thank you for that and reminding us of that. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back with some questions for our guests on Islam currently in the Black community. Welcome back. My next question is to you, Sheikh Jaaber. You've been quoted before saying your favorite surah is Surah Ikhlas, and that dawah is not yet there in America, and that it will not be there until everyone in America understands the mercy and justice behind the message of this surah. Can you tell us more about these thoughts and what efforts should imams and others who lead the Muslim community in the United States, especially the African American community, what is your message to them?
Yes, I think we have to go back to the Black Power struggle in the 60s and the position of the Muslims. I grew up in a diverse, integrated Islamic society. We had people in our community that was from Yemen. We had people that were in our community from Syria, from Sudan, from all over in the 20s and 30s. Okay, now my father himself is cited in the Kerner Report, 1967 riots. He stood between the tanks, flanked with National Guards, okay, and the rioters, because the mayor of that city, Elizabeth, New Jersey, Dunn, had given the order shoot to kill. And he himself carteled the riot. Were not to destroy the society. The position of the Muslims were not to burn down the buildings. We have always operated in a society where our role is just to invite people to Islam. We have no agenda of aggression. And again, we could not totally embrace the Black Power struggle, the Pan-Africanist struggle. And even Malcolm himself, once he encountered one ambassador from Algeria, when he was talking about Black nationalism and the struggle for social justice, he asked him, Malcolm, what does this say for the people of Morocco? What does this say for the people of Algeria? What does this say for the people of Egypt? All of those people are struggling for the colonization of Africa, and they're struggling for social justice. So the platform of Malcolm had to be broadened. And again, Malcolm himself, like I said, was actually isolated from a lot of the dynamics of Islam that was going on in America. And he said that in his Hajj, when he completed his Hajj, he said, I think I may be the first American Negro to perform the Hajj. Well, we had tons of Hajjs that had performed Hajj. We had Abd'al-Rahim from Philadelphia, Lynn Hope. We had Hajj Wale Akram, who started the first mosque in Cleveland, who made Hajj in 1957. We had Hajj Hassan in 1952 in New York. My father had made Hajj in 1962. What I'm saying is that, but he felt that he was the first Haji that had made the pilgrimage. But because the Muslim had a different approach for social justice, it wasn't a violent approach. It wasn't an aggressive approach. However, the anger was still there to fight off discrimination, oppression, and things of this nature. Even Leroy Jones, we know him as Amir Baraka, who my father gave Shahada to him and his wife. They had a difference of a position about bringing about social justice. They were more forceful. They were about violence. They were about burning down cities. So we felt that if we could bring Islam, right, the true Islam to the society, that it would remove the stigma of a violent revolution. Even Malcolm himself said, perhaps if America could look at Islam, it would solve the race problem. So we always looked at Islam and the elements of Islam, and our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, has been a mercy for all the nations, you know. And he suffered the worst case scenario. His uncle Hamza, and who was also his foster brother, was killed, okay, in the Battle of Uhud by a Ethiopian, okay. And Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, cut open the body of Hamza and began to eat his liver. But when they came to Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, he forgave Hind. Okay, he told Wahish, I forgive you, and you just can't live in Medina because it hurts me so much. What I'm saying is that if we have to look at the mercy that Islam brings, you know, we have to be able to separate what has transpired in the past, because we never want to be able to rectify that. Those people are to be held responsible for the injustice that they impose upon the people. Our plight is in real time today as Muslims, but we can never deviate from our Islamic principles of how to deal with the human being, even if in the worst case scenario of oppression, injustice, discrimination, we still have to be Muslim at the end of the day and address it according to example of our Prophet Muhammad and the dictates of the Quran.
Jazakallah khair for that. Sister Islah, I'd like to ask you your thoughts of the current on the current state of affairs of Islam in the United States, in the communities that you live and work in. What are some positive developments that you've seen, and what are some things that worry you?
Alhamdulillah. Well, in terms of positives, Islam is growing. More and more people, you know, come and take Shahada. Alhamdulillah, that part is good. I think that some of the masajid that have been traditionally segregated ethnically or racially have started to make attempts to address that, bring in diversity and welcome people into their congregations that are from different backgrounds, and that's good. In terms of, and we give praise for all of that. In terms of the things that concern me, I liken this period to our adolescence in America. We went through an infancy of coming to Islam, of people discovering their Islamic identities, of figuring out, as our brother has mentioned, what is and what isn't Islam, and what is from Quran and Sunnah and what is not. And it's sort of carried over into this era where, and I call it our adolescence, because we're trying to figure out again, our still figuring out our identity, maturing into, are we going to follow the Sunnah, Quran and Sunnah, or are we going to follow personalities? How are we going to integrate technology into the transmission of ilm? Whereas, our tradition may suggest that we work with a teacher, study with a teacher. And because of the availability of information, we don't have to necessarily sit with a teacher in order to get information. And so we have as a result of that, people who have not studied formally under someone, but who, because of technology, can command a following. So we're going to have to contend with that. We also have to look at, right now, there are issues about the role of the masjid in the community. And I think that technology has played a role in that, in the sense that, I became Muslim in the 70s. And for me, as I was telling some younger people the other night, the masjid was everything. I couldn't wait to get there. I was happy when there were activities at the masjid beyond just the Salat and Jumu'ah. It was the center of our existence. Not so much now. You have Muslims who become Muslim and never really visit the masjid. So we have to, look at how the role of the masjid is evolving and make sure that it is in line with the role it has played in Islamic tradition. So right now, I think that oh, I'm sorry. And also two big issues that I think that we're dealing with right now are the issues of race and gender, and how Islam will move from the beliefs the ideals that we have been taught to the practical implementation of those ideals. Our young people have made a lot of comments, books, statements, lectures about how they feel as young African Americans, young Black people, young Latinos, in the context of the Muslim Jama'ah, of the Muslim Ummah, and whether or not they feel validated, whether they feel welcome. And I was explaining that when I accepted Islam, we were so eager. We were so eager to be in this fold, and we looked at it as almost our metaphorical North Star. This is the way to everything from liberation to it was our hope. And we came in, and then shortly thereafter, we started to realize that all was not as it may have appeared to be, and that the practice was somewhat different. And our children and our children's children are now grappling with that. And so we have these issues, that we have to contend with. Our role in terms of the world ummah. How do we fit with that? What is our responsibility toward other groups of Muslims all over the world? And a lot of this has been, or all of it really has been spelled out in Islam, but we are now in the process of growing up Islamically. How do we actually start to implement these things, these ideals? And what will be my generation's legacy in doing that? Because a lot of us were first generation Muslims. So I think right now, things are hopeful, of course, because, we have Islam. But as we watch, and I'll call it, as someone else has said, the system of the Dajjal being unfolded, as we get closer to the last days, we will find that there will not always be clarity unless we hold fast to the rope of Allah, unless we turn back to the traditions of the Quran and Sunnah. And so we have to make sure that we rid Islam of anything, our practice of Islam, of anything that's going to detract from that, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair for that very deep answer. Sheikh Jaaber, would you like to add anything of your things that you're noticing that are some highlights and some things that are concerning you as well?
Yes, Bismillah. One of the main things that concern me, especially in America, is the methodology of dawah. We are well aware that a large number of people who came from Africa as slaves were Muslims. But they lost that Islamic heritage, they lost that Islamic identity, and they lost the faith. And by them coming back to Islam, I think that we identify the religion of Islam with ethnicity and culture, which actually places certain segments of our society at odds, to the point that the misconception of Islam, when it's embraced, is an anti-American, formula. Okay, and it isolates and marginalizes other people. For example, how can we, as people who are descendants of slaves, right, bring Islam, to the society? We have to be on equal footing, as we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He sent Musa alayhi salam, peace and blessing be upon him, not only to the children of Israel, but He sent him also to Fir'aun. Okay, so we have to break down these racial barriers and the misconception and perception that Islam is only a religion that belongs to people of color or third world nations. And that if we can bring pure Islam, the theology of Islam, without culture and ethnicity attached to it, I think it will have a greater impact in our society, that people can look at like the sister said, we have to go beyond personalities. We can look at the very articles of Islam, the very values and principles that Islam offers, its problem solving methods and so forth and so on. And we have to go back into history and see these examples actually as they were implemented during the time of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him. As we know, the Kaaba, the sacred house of Mecca, was attempted to be destroyed by an Abyssinian by the name of Abd'al-Rahim. However, the first migrations of the Muslims were to Abyssinia. Okay, was to an Abyssinian nation. So we see that the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessing be upon him, did not allow ethnicity and cultural trends to interfere with delivering the message. And I think that if we can look at what has transpired in the past, and we can become a more forgiving people and begin to invite people to Islam, as opposed to containing Islam as a cultural a product and using it as an excuse to strike back and get social justice. I think that is the problem that we're running into, that some people are just closing their ears and their eyes to the beautiful message of Islam, because the presenters of it have with it a tainted idea of racism, or and the idea that Islam is going to bring about a liberation for a particular people. And I think if we can move beyond that and allow the theology of Islam to integrate in the culture, that people will be able to look at the benefit and use the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, in the proper context as the centerpiece, okay, of the example of how we solve our problem.
Well, we're going to be right back after a break. Thank you so much. Right back after these messages. Welcome back. I would like to ask you, as we start talking about the future, things that worry us as parents, as grandparents, when I look at just social media and how things have just changed in the past 5 years, or the ideologies that are being shoved down our kids' faces in the name of justice, that are totally counter to our faith. And then I also look at this extreme individualism that is preached through social media. And we know that Islam is an answer and a solution to all of these issues that we see. But there seems to be a disconnect. And as some of the things that you pointed out is sometimes the messaging is wrong, sometimes the messaging seems foreign. What does the future look like to you all? Like, if you can imagine a future for the next generations that are coming into the deen, that are staying in the deen, especially when it comes to the use of using Islam as some sort of, like an identity label that you wear on your heart or your sleeve, instead of being a faith that is to be followed day in and day out. So I'd like you guys to please enlighten us with your thoughts on that.
I like to start because I think I'm going to have to leave you all more faster than I did sister. But, I wrote a book called Color Me Muslim. I did my high schooling in New York City in the 70s. And I wrote this book as a survival guide to show young Muslims how to navigate in a non-Islamic society, how to say no when it is time to say no, and when it's to say yes, time to say yes. And as parents, I don't think we've done enough to actually solidify our Islamic identity in the culture. America is the type of society that welcomes diversity. You can travel all over America and you see so many different ethnic groups who have their own social expression. They go unhindered as they contribute to the society. And I think that as Muslims, when we came to America, for the most part, we were escaping the ill effects of socialism, communism, failed governments, and things of this nature. And we just wanted to get into the relaxed mode. And as a result of that, we allowed a generation to grow up in America without acknowledging the beauty of Islam, because it was the countries in which we came out of was so horrific and so torn that we contributed that to Islam by not understanding these other foreign elements that had destroyed the Islamic culture and society. And again, the youth grew up without Islam. Now we have a reversion. People now realizing that all of this wasn't Islam, and they're trying to now re-identify with the faith. However, their children have gravitated towards American culture, and it's almost like reintroducing them to Islam. And the only connection they have with Islam is culture. And culture is not enough to instill in a child or a youth or a young person, the strength to actually reject the negativity in the society. I don't think we do enough as to criticize the social ills that's eroding the moral fabric of the society, not just for the Muslim, but for non-Muslims alike. We are moral physicians. Whenever we see a wrong in any form or any fashion, we should address it. And I think that we need to stand as one united front when we are addressing the principles of Islam. Our weakness comes to our divisions, and again, I think that ethnicity sometimes interfere. The fight that we had in the 60s, the fight that Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz was fighting, the fight that we experienced, I grew up in segregated schools, is not the fight that we need to be fighting today. We need to find different ways and means to integrate. Just because a person has a lighter complexion does not mean that person is an enemy to you. Okay, just because a person has darker skin does not mean he's less on the social wrong than you. So as Muslims, we have to come together and create a think tank and a strategy as to how we're going to actually move forward and how we're going to rescue our youth beyond Islam being a cultural identity or a fad or a fashion, and let the faith of Islam enter into their heart so that they will be able to actually contribute and move the society forward.
Jazakallah khair for your answer, and I know you have to leave, so Jazakallah khair for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. Sister Isla, I wanted to ask. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say that I'm going to Mecca Saturday, and I'm going to pray for the Muslims. I've been praying for the Muslims in Medina, and I'm praying for our brothers and sisters in Turkey, and that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, strengthen them, give those who lost their lives through that tragedy, give them paradise and forgive them their sins. They are our brothers and sisters, and we have to make dua for them and do whatever we can to support their families, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. Keep us in your du'as as well.
Ameen. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Sister Isla, I wanted to ask you, Tyree Nichols passed away. He was beaten to death. And a couple of days after his death, the Muslim community found out that he had accepted Islam the year before. The reactions started coming in, and those who on principle oppose police brutality issued their statements regardless of whether he was Muslim or not. Whereas the rest decided that his life was only worth it once they found out that he was a Muslim brother. This scenario really shone a spotlight on some things that we really need to work on in our communities if we want to succeed in giving dawah in the future. So what are your thoughts about this and if you could put that in the context as about giving dawah in the future, about Islam in the Black community, about justice in the face of adversity, especially in your role as an educator?
Okay, alhamdulillah. I think more education is needed. Knowledge can be power if it is acquired in if it is acquired in a good context and used in a good way, because knowledge in and of itself is neutral. So you have people who are well-meaning and they see issues and they don't have sometimes enough Islamic knowledge to know how to process whatever is happening at the time. And so that's going to be one of our challenges for the future in terms of understanding how do we determine what is right, and what's wrong, the parameters. There's certain things that our inner spirit may speak to us and say to us when we see a wrong. And it doesn't really qualify that by saying if we see this type of wrong or that type of evil. It says when you see wrong, you have options in terms of how we as Muslims deal with those wrongs. We can, change it with our hands, we can change it with our mouth, or we can hate it within our hearts. And the research that I've done on that myself suggests that hating in your heart is not just a passive thing. It has to really do something to you physically. It should not be that you can see injustice, murder, oppression, and have it not affect you. And the more we learn our deen, the more we should be affected by those things that we see. We should become sensitized to them and not desensitized to them. But we live in a society that serves to desensitize us. So we then have to try to figure out, how do we respond? Someone got murdered. There's a natural response to that when you see someone being victimized. But sometimes we have to step back and figure out, okay, what does Islam tell us to do? Okay, there's a good side to that, in that we should always check our actions and before proceeding with them. Our actions should be preceded by knowledge. But the bad side is that we can become so hesitant, and we can be people who are afraid of reacting in an authentic way because of what the masses of Muslims may say. So in terms of how we respond to that, I think that at this point we have to go deeper with our knowledge. And I go back to, always, if you're talking about putting things in a context of how does this relate to our future, then I look at Surah Al-Asr. Verily, we're at loss unless, we have faith and join together in truth, have patience, are constant. We have to decide as human beings, as Muslims, is this the deen that we're going to practice? One. And if this is the deen that we're going to practice, what does Islam actually enjoin upon us? Two. And are we able to submit to that? And if we feel like we are having problems with that, we have another choice. Okay, do you reject that, which would be, take you outside of Islam, or do we ask Allah to help us learn how to be Muslims? A lot of us think we already know, but from what we can see in the state of the world, many of us are still learning how to be Muslims. So when we see these things, when we see oppression, what is it that we have in our toolbox as Muslims to correct those issues? I don't think that we can just, our role is not to just exist in this society without trying to better it, and the betterment of this society has to come through Islam. So when you talk about issues of social justice, issues of oppression, whether they are against Muslims or not, there should be within our hearts and minds a way that we know that we can react and respond. And I said earlier, I think we're at our adolescent stage because we still don't know. There's so many people that are grappling with that. For me, I saw that, a young man had died, and I have a certain response to that. I do think, and what I'm hearing in the back of my head right now are the things that were said historically about Muslims in America, saying that we only care about other Muslims. We only care about other Muslims. And I don't see Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as being a person who only cared about the Muslims. His life did not suggest that. So I'm hoping that's not going to be our modern takeaway. He was a man who cared about humanity and
Mercy to all mankind.
all mankind. And if we kill one person, it's like we kill all of humanity. So with that, I'll just say that we need to really learn our deen, be willing to submit to what it says, have the faith that within this deen, there are the answers to these questions, that we don't have to change it, manipulate it, massage it, compromise it. The answers are there, but the answers are tied to our submission. We have to submit to this deen in order for us to be able to implement the cures for the problems. So that's my takeaway, and that's my hope, is that we start to learn more and more and go back to really studying and trying to submit and implement this deen.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for being with us here on the Justice for All Now show.
Thank you.
And I wanted to thank our producer, Asim Amin, and our assistant, Miriam Tisdale. Thank you all for joining us on the Justice for All Now show on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum.